$20,000 a flat fee, or is it dependent on the size of the company and the number of permits you're expecting?
For the pilot program, that is the specific $20,000 flat fee for all TNC operators.
That doesn't seem fair. If some companies have far more drivers, if you're looking at cost recovery, what's the expected enforcement mechanisms, and how much is that going to cost for you to be checking on these companies?
So we are not planning for the pilot program to add any more resources to the Pirate Fire program. So those costs for the program will remain the same.
So what is the enforcement mechanism? How many people will you have checking?
There are currently 5 regulatory program specialists who are out enforcing, plus we have the administrator who can enforce.
So we're going to have 1,000 more drivers, and we're not going to have any more people checking?
Well, I think part of that is the auditing function, that we will randomly audit the certification list and driver's list. So we have that as well. But on the street, they have 6.
I would also like to point out that we're working on adding some administrative help so that we can move some of the administrative work that the current regulatory program specialists are doing can be put onto the administrative help, and they can focus more on enforcement efforts.
So how does a company like Curb, which is a transportation network company which uses TaxiCab, it's basically the app that gets somebody like me to get to a taxi driver rather than an Uber or Lyft driver, would they have to pay $20,000 as well?
So they are not a transportation network company. They are a third-party dispatch provider that partners with permanent taxi companies.
So they would not have to pay anything?
Correct. We currently do not have any fees specifically for third-party dispatchers.
Okay. My next question is about, was raised about the age of the driver. Our regulations say 21, which having had 3 children just past 21, I would be very nervous about any of them being taxi drivers. Why do we pick 21 rather than 25?
It's in the current code.
For taxis and LPTs.
Can we impound Uber cars? The mention was that we could tow.
As part of the ordinance, we have proposed some civil forfeiture language that strengthens our position legally in terms of towing and impoundment of vehicles. So the long answer is yes. Or short.
Long hearing, short answer.
Yeah.
And then my final question might be for some of the cab companies. Are all cab companies required to have GPS in all of their vehicles?
Are they required to have GPS? Or do they typically?
I don't believe that's a requirement in our code.
Not a requirement, but it's a practice that all the cabs do have GPS.
Typically.
Because that's, colleagues, I have learned to my detriment over the last 7 months that that's incredibly important in figuring out when a crash occurred, is to have that GPS in a commercial vehicle. So I'm wondering if that doesn't show up on your personal cell phone, but it does show up on the GPS. So I'm wondering if we're in this, when is the app on, when is the app off, which phase are we in, how are we going to know in the transportation network cars where they are and when an incident happened?
For transportation network companies, you're asking how will the city know where the drivers are?
Yeah, how do you pinpoint when a crash happens? If there's all these 3 different phases of when different coverage applies, how does, in a crash situation, how do you pinpoint when the crash happened?
You can take a look at all of the activity that has occurred on the platform and determine, what events in the real world occurred based on the different activities on the platform.
But you wouldn't know whether the car had hit another car just before pressing the button or just before after pressing the button.
I'm sorry, I need some clarity on your question. What button and who's pushing the button?
The driver of the transportation network company has to tap their screen, as we heard, in order to accept a ride. Without the GPS, which tracks real-time situations, there's no way to tell when the crash happens.
I think a TNC representative will better answer that question.
Them back up.
Yeah.
So why don't we save those technical questions for that? Other questions for our team?
So I have a question, foreshadowing what I think will be a discussion we'll have a little bit next. And that is, Well, two questions. One is, if the resolution passes, when does the director intend to promulgate and issue interim rules?
She will be immediately directed to do so. So that can be taken up as soon as tomorrow.
Okay? And when is the earliest TNC could come in and seek a permit?
That would be based on the director actually instituting the administrative rules to institute the policy, and it would be dependent upon the companies applying for a permit, staff reviewing the permit application, and either issuing a recommendation to the commissioner in charge to approve or deny that application.
What's your sense, Brian, in terms of the time, how much time will it take once you've established the rules and the process, when is the earliest that you anticipate a permit issuing?
It could be a matter of days. It could be a matter of days.
So you have the agreement already drafted that sets forth all the requirements?
The principles presented to you today are significantly, or would essentially serve as those administrative rules. There would not be significant changes, with the exceptions of amendments that council would like to incorporate tonight.
And the written agreements that the TNCs have to enter into, those have been drafted?
They're in the process of being drafted, and they're not finalized, but that would be, as you mentioned, Commissioner, something that would have to be done before the company permit is garnered. There's also the issue of their insurance